dedicated to empowering you with information
to make positive choices
and be advocates for your overall well-being.
Welcome to The Health View. Welcome to The Health View. I'm Yvonne Dunitz, and this is Dr. Laura Chan, and this is Dr. Margarita Ochomaya. We're delighted to have you with us today, and our topic for today are the causes of obesity. But before we begin, we had a viewer that sent in a question, and their question was, I have a very difficult time with food when I travel. I find that I always gain weight and feel that I am limited in healthy eating options. What do you recommend?
That's a really good question.
It is.
It's
a problem for everyone.
Everyone.
Yeah.
I'm included in that one.
When
Yeah,
you think
me
about
too.
even in the airports, I mean, some of them are getting better related to the food, but a lot of it is just junk or anywhere
It's
you go,
true.
it's hard. So what would you recommend?
So first of all, it's hard to stay active usually when you're traveling. There are a lot of different activities. You're out of your routine. So sometimes I suggest if you're in an airport, for instance, and you have to wait for your flight, get up and mill around a little bit. Walk, be active, and try that instead of just being sedentary while you're waiting. You can just stand and shift your weight back and forth on your feet, even just to be active a little bit that way while you're waiting. And then in terms of food, there are better options than others inside airports and when you're traveling, things like that. You don't have to stop at the fast food places. You can stop at a grocery store while you're traveling and pick up an avocado and some rice cakes and do something like that instead of the quick calorie-heavy option.
So that would be if you're traveling in a car.
If you're traveling in a car.
Because in the plane, before the screening, they don't.
Yeah, and in an airport, a lot of places have salads. You can get a nice piece of chicken breast on a salad, something like that. There are options. You just have to make a little bit more effort and commit to it, which is one of the harder parts.
Yes. And nowadays they have these packages with nuts if you don't have allergies for nuts
Yep.
that you can take
Yes.
with you. They have also dried fruits
Yep.
that might be a good resource. What are your thoughts about recommendations for when you travel as far as eating well, making good choices, and helping to be healthy?
I always consider if there's going to be a time change or not. Because usually when there's time change, I think we always get a little off our routine, like you mentioned. And so, like breakfast is probably a brunch, and then we're mostly snacking while traveling rather than having bigger meals unless you're going to a restaurant. And so then I also think of navigating the restaurants per se, navigating the menu, trying to understand what is available to you, what would be less caloric, and then portion control. Very importantly, in our restaurants, we get served pretty large portions. And so sometimes sharing a meal or finding if you can have half to go before the first meal is served, those are wonderful tips when you are traveling and how to control both calorie as well as your choices.
You know, it's a perfect follow-up question to that about reading about menus. A lot of people don't know how to read a menu to know, I mean, some of them are listing calories or they put the heart for heart friendly.
Right.
What would you recommend for them as to really know about the good, really healthy choices? And are they, if they list them as healthy choices or not? Did you want to start with that?
I'll start with that. I think I'm always so interested in speaking with the restaurant associations, and I know Laura with your husband, and conceptually trying to bring some ownership at the restaurant level, at the chef's level, to really understand the caloric as well as nutritional impact of their food. Sometimes we go for the more Epicurean, more fancy, more creamy, more salty, and certainly a lot more butter, because those are very tasty and they actually are quite palatable. And if we are thinking that we're going to go out to a restaurant, we think, okay, this is our opportunity. But I think bringing it back to that understanding where those menus now, I know many restaurants offer vegetarian as well as a gluten alternative. And so I'm thinking, yes, a heart and a D, or something that would say, without stigma, if you have heart disease, diabetes, high cholesterol, or are having a problem with weight, and you want to try to have that lighter, healthier option, I think a heart and a D would be amazing.
And your thoughts?
Yeah, also at most restaurants, you walk in and immediately a basket of bread is put down in front of you, bread and butter. And so it's easy to overeat because it's in front of you, you're hungry while you're waiting for your meal, and that's a pretty high caloric option right there that's immediately put in front of you. And so I'll caution people to say, maybe hold off on that, but order a salad to start and enjoy that instead, just to fill up on something a little bit healthier beforehand. And I think many people are tempted to order dessert when they're out and traveling, and you don't have to. You can get a decaf coffee instead and sip on that and enjoy that and really be mindful of the amount that you're eating out to eat. It's easy to fall into the culture of the amount of food that's put in front of you.
And eat a little more slowly.
And eat a little bit more slowly.
Right. And when you're traveling, sometimes you're eating quickly in between, grabbing. And,
Right.
But the key is to take with you some good, healthy snacks and things that you can
Just
eat.
one other idea that I follow. For instance, this past weekend over Labor Day, I was visiting my grandmother, and we went out for dinner together, and we couldn't get a reservation until late. And so I felt like, I ate a big meal later than usual. And so
Great point.
the next morning, I ate a very light breakfast. And usually I like to eat a nice hearty breakfast, but I felt like I was able to balance the really heavy meal. And so I'll tell my patients that frequently, to try to give yourself a break between heavy meals. And if you eat something big the night before, eat something lighter the next morning, rather than following your habit.
Absolutely. I'd like to thank our viewer very much for their question and encourage everybody what we love to do. Any questions that you have, any input related to topics that you'd like us to cover, contact us at info@YCD Holistic Healing. And what we're going to be doing is collecting very confidentially the names and contact information of all of you that come with questions or recommendations. And then we're going to have at certain times of the year different surprises of gift baskets or gift items that we will draw from, put your names in a hat and draw, and just to show you our appreciation for your involvement in our program. So today we're talking about causes of obesity. So let's talk about the relationship with food and how it works related to boredom and food addiction. So which one of you would like
I'll
to
start with that.
Go
It's
for
a
it.
big topic,
It
and I
is.
know that we could even devote a whole program to that. But as we were talking about food and travel, and as we're thinking about what really food means to us, the number one thing is that we are a communal society, and we love to gather together to eat food. And so when we have social gatherings, when we get together, that is a form of social interaction. And so sometimes we actually can blend that pleasurable activity of being in family and being together with the fact that eating gives us pleasure. So then it brings out to boredom and loneliness, and what we tend to do to soothe ourselves would be to eat. And so I think the most important part is that we're now bringing the conversation of food addiction to the table, and it is somewhat shameful for people to even discuss it or bring it up. And if we do it in a love, beautiful communal relationship of helping each other, and then trying to get the root of the problem where you're bored and then you want to eat, and then that is a form of self-soothing. We can understand that from a psychological point of view. What do you think?
Related to when does food addiction actually
Absolutely.
begin? When does it cross the line where it becomes food addiction?
I think that's a little bit arbitrary still, and it's based on a personal level, but I think it's when someone doesn't feel like they have control over when they're eating, and when it becomes very mindless, and someone might even say, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize I've been munching on these chips for the last 5 minutes, because they were looking at the TV or doing something else. So there's a lack of awareness, typically, and a lack of control when it becomes more addictive.
And I think recognizing the patterns of eating behavior. So some people actually, unfortunately, when they get up really kind of somewhat late for work or whatever, do not have breakfast. There's a great majority of our community and people who don't have breakfast have a very light lunch, and then after a whole day's of work come home and have a very large meal, and that's about the time they're going to go to sleep. The other group of people are those that have a lot of multiple munchies throughout the day. They're more like a little grazing, and the concept of more just a little bit of meals, but very constant and very frequently, and so there's no major periods of fasting. And then, of course, there's those that have the 3 balanced meals. But I think it's also very important to understand the pattern of eating, because that way, when you understand how you're eating, then you can maybe have more control over your choices, like you said. And so definitely that mind-body connection that you so nicely speak about, Yvonne, I think it's very important to discuss those.
I know for myself, sometimes in the morning, it's so hectic, and for a while there, I was missing breakfast myself. So my thing that I've been doing for the past few years now is I make healthy smoothies, and I change it up each day, and I can make it, and actually now I've got myself a nice cup that I can put in the car. I can take
can
with
drink
me
it in the car.
so that I have this healthy smoothie so that I don't have to miss it.
I set up my blender the night before,
There
and
you
so
go.
that way, and then I have my little routine with my kitchen and my blender. But
Yeah.
for sure, I think I call it astronaut food or more designer nutrition, specifically because if that's not the case where we're going to be gathering and being together, and it's going to be in the run, and you're going to maybe even be eating in the car, which we won't even think about the dangers of that does. It's like worse than
No.
texting in the
Yeah,
car.
yeah, it's
So I think it's all well said, right?
Okay, so we're talking about the causes of obesity. So you mentioned about boredom and food addiction and the relationship with food. Well, where does the gut and the biome healthy guests in the gut all play a part?
I'm excited about this topic. And one thing that I want to bring up as we move into this topic, I just had a patient this week who weighs a lot more than she wants to. She's been working at losing weight, and she got a copy of her medical records, and it said something about, you know, the patient is unable to lose weight because she overeats too much and doesn't exercise. And she was very upset about this and was telling me about it. She said, I don't overeat and I do exercise. And she said, and she had been following my dietary recommendations, so her diet was pretty healthy. We were tweaking things, and she said,
See that happen all the time.
she said, I feel like it's something else. She said, I really feel like it's something that's not related to food intake and exercise. And I said, you know what, you're right. I really think that could be the case. And a lot of times I think it is. And so I'm glad we're having this show, because obesity is not always about calories in, calories out. There can be other problems.
So what are
and
the
so we'll
other
talk about that.
problems?
So one of them, in addition to a combination of things, could be an imbalance of the good bacteria, actually, in your digestive tract. We call it the microbiome, and we do have bacteria, and they help with digesting our food. They live in our digestive tract. Many people are aware that maybe yogurt has healthy bacteria in it, and so that's one of the many strains that we would optimally find in our digestive tract. Well, some studies have shown that people who are overweight or obese have different flora, different bacteria in their digestive tract than people who are thin. They've done this on mice studies, and we're starting to get more information in human studies to see that there's a difference. And so it's very interesting that it's not just about behavior, but that there's actually a biochemical difference in the
That's a
bodies.
great point. That's a great point, because now, very importantly, we see some strains of bacteria that are more associated with being overweight, and then some strains that are not. And that brings a little bit into our environment. You know, the overuse of antacids, for example, allow for some unhealthy bacteria to cross through.
Antacids and antibiotics.
And then, of course, antibiotics. And then, of course, with some people with taking very prolonged, antibiotic use, ultimately the bacteria in your gut become resistant and grow in these environments. And also that brings back to food. And I know we constantly talk about food, but at the same time, radiating the food, having these antibiotic washes.
Microwaving, you mean, yeah.
No, they sometimes radiate them prior to getting to the grocery stores to prevent some outbreaks of bacteria. And so they're being pre-washed, pre-cleaned, and pre-treated. And so ultimately, the bugs in our gut and our environment are clearly being changed by that behavior.
So
Right.
how would we even find out? How would you, as primary care provider doctors in the field, know to look at the gut? And what types of tests would you be doing to look at the gut to determine, here's this problem, and now what do we do about it?
It's a good question, and as far as I'm aware, there are not common tests to do for it in terms of it's things you're not going to do at most primary care doctor's office. You can get a stool sample done and see, is there an imbalance of certain types of bacteria? And I'm only aware of specialty labs that do that. Are you aware of more conventional
That's the
labs
truth.
that do
I
that?
think from a conventional point of view, it depends. There are actually,
Yeah.
and there's several ongoing studies right now at Mass General where they will even evaluate what kind of strains, and they will even do something called poop transfer. So I know this might be a bit too much, but on the other hand, very importantly, is trying to understand what is in your poop. So there is a specialty, there are several specialty labs that do and will evaluate, but in the common labs, You can have the regular primary care doctor can check for parasites,
Yep.
which, are another
More and
kind
more
of different
people
than bacteria, but other hosts
And
that
more-
are undesirable.
And more common than one would think, even in this country.
Exactly. And so, and unfortunately, like there's not a very common treatments, but we are well aware of several treatments we can give. But also an overgrowth of yeast. So yeast is fungi, and I know, again, this is getting a bit on the gross side,
but
but
it's
it's
important to
important
know.
stuff. It really is important.
and you have an overgrowth of yeast in your gut, and then you have a problem, irritable bowel, alternating by diarrhea. And so now at the gut level of every kind, so we do have our hosts, but at the same time, we can go from basic evaluation to your own interpretation, like, oh, I'm not having regularity, or I'm having some issues that really stem at the root. And I'll add one last one. Frequently with people who are overweight, they tend to have gallbladder problems, and then they get removed. And as you have had your removal of your gallbladder, then you think it's like the appendix, you don't need it anymore, but truly digestion gets clearly impacted by this problem of not having a gallbladder.
Right.
You agree?
I do, and I want to go back to the yeast thing. Some other symptoms that people will have sometimes when this is an issue are actually neurological. Sometimes a sense of brain fog can be an issue, or even skin rashes. Sometimes a little bit of itchy dermatitis, a rash on the skin, can be a symptom that there's an imbalance in the digestive tract.
I mean, this is all good for the audience,
Yeah.
too, because they might not have even realized. Some might be having some skin reactions
Right.
to different things, and it could be a result of what's happening in the gut.
Right, and
Are
this
there
and it
symptoms?
is treatable. Diet changes can be really helpful. So yeast feed off of sugar, and so there's actually an interesting theory. I'm curious what you think about this too. That if someone does have an imbalance of yeast in their digestive tract and there's too much, that contributes to the craving of more sugar. So it's not the person themselves, in theory, that's
Absolutely.
craving the sugar, but it's this imbalance in
And
their
so
digestive tract.
How would you find that out? How would you know that there's
So you would do a stool test through
all
a,
kinds
But
either
I
through a
think we even
specialty lab.
we even discussed this in our previous show where we could do an elimination diet because
Yep.
lastly we did mention acne as a rash.
Yeah.
Yep.
But then even back to the sources of weight and weight problems, we talked about not always diet and exercise
Right.
is the real bottom line. And so a lot of people who feel embarrassed that they think people are going to think I'm just dwelling into the candy, I think not necessarily. There are other causes. We talked about the gut and that our healthy hosts, and then thirdly, our hormones and a hormonal imbalance. And so if a person's not sleeping, their adrenal hormones aren't working, if their thyroid is not working, then there might be a situation where you're gaining weight and what is the problem? I've gained 15 pounds in the last 2 months. There must be a problem.
Right.
They hadn't changed their eating. And lastly, menopause and low testosterone in men,
Right.
high weight gain.
And I find that people will get their hormones tested, their primary care doctor will do sort of some screening tests, but there still might be some hormone imbalance, even if those tests come back normal, because you can do more thorough testing. So if someone's really just tried everything, they say, oh, my lab tests are normal, I think it's possible that you really can do more detail-oriented lab testing to see, is the thyroid off in a different way? Is there a different component of it that's out of balance? And the adrenals aren't typically tested for, and those can be looked for.
So let's talk about that hormonal balance a little more from the adrenal point of view, thyroid point of view, female and male hormones point of view. What are the things that we can bring to our audience's attention related to what to look for? What are the common areas?
So glands. Let's start with glands. And our glands in our body somewhat are the communicator antennas. They try to relate one thing over the other. And
Which are the glands?
the adrenal gland.
Which
Well,
are
okay, we'll
located-
start. You mentioned this
Yes.
one. So we'll start with the thyroid
Right.
gland, which is right in the neck. Between the Adam's apple and kind of the little hole in between the clavicles, right in the middle there.
Right.
That's where the thyroid is. And I know we'll have a whole show dedicated to this and actually this month's Thyroid Awareness Month. So
Yes.
nonetheless, it's all wonderful when trying to understand this little beautiful gland. But the adrenals are primary to the thyroid because the adrenals are like the generators. They are constantly producing energy, adrenaline. They're the ones kind of in charge of your fight or flight stress reaction. And so the adrenal glands, if they don't get turned off by sleeping, it's a very big deal. Would you like to talk about circadian rhythm?
Sure. Well, I think
So
we brought it up in
exciting.
another show, but our adrenals should be active in the morning, and we should release a normal amount of our stress hormone to get us going, to think clearly, to be energized, to feel good when you wake up in the morning.
Right.
And then those hormones, like our adrenaline, sort of a broader name for them, should decline by the end of the day, and we should be able to fall asleep. And then come the middle of the night, it'll start to spike, and then be high again in the morning. So that would be a normal circadian rhythm where your adrenal hormones spike in the morning and go down. And that's not what a lot of people will look like. We might find that some people are a little bit more flatlined with their adrenal hormones, where they just wake up and they don't feel alert, and they just feel kind of brain foggy, and they have 3 cups of coffee because they just can't wake up. Those people might gain weight as part of that hormone imbalance. And often I find when people's adrenals are low, they crave more sugar, because sugar is a way to get a little burst of energy. And so when people are craving sugar a lot, it could maybe be a yeast imbalance in the gut, and it could be some adrenal fatigue.
So from an adrenal fatigue point of view, the tests that are done to distinguish that, if that's a problem, is that blood work, or is that?
So yeah, that is a sensitive topic, because there we go again, specialty labs versus not, and what is FDA approved or what is approved in commonplace and traditional medicine is involved as to functional medicine.
Yes.
But so there is a saliva test that you can do where you actually put your saliva in a little cup first thing when you wake up, around noontime, around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and around 11 to 12 midnight. And so when we look at that, when you were saying that curve, where it should be nicely up in the morning and flat at the end of the day. And so when that is not happening, you're not having that reset opportunity for your metabolism to work. And so all that turns into a steroid-like behavior that can promote diabetes, the craving, and that's called cortisol. And so that can create that mid-gain right in the middle. And that's from very stressed out situations. But again, the stress we have today, the use of our TVs, our computers, we're not sleeping. And then it ties again with one of our other shows, right?
It does. And I do want to clarify, I have found that the phrase adrenal fatigue, which we're using, is not used a lot in conventional medicine. But I like to point out to people, there are true diseases on one end of the spectrum in terms of your adrenal glands. And we're talking more about sort of leaning that way a little bit, where the adrenals just aren't working in their optimal way. They're not putting out the optimal amount of hormones, but you're not yet in a disease state. Would you say so?
I totally agree. I think I'm so excited that we both share such common concepts. I just love
How about
that.
inflammation and toxicity?
Ooh, I like such a topic.
That's great.
Okay, go for it.
I'm passionate about this
Go ahead.
topic because I am concerned about what we're exposed to in our environment and how it affects our health. And there's actually a lot of interesting information coming out about how some of the toxins we're exposed to in the environment can affect our metabolism and contribute to obesity. So we're kind of in the infancy, I think, in terms of doing our research in this.
There's quite a bit in the endocrine
good,
world
yeah.
called endocrine disruptors. And so those are called gender-bending hormones, which are in our environment, which then create a very significant hormonal imbalance. So in men, rather than having low testosterone, they have high estrogen, which then behaves like low testosterone. And in women, having too much estrogen in their system, as we know the consequences, the increase in breast cancer, as well as the increase in weight gain when we're starting to have those hormonal imbalances. So I'm sure, and I would be delighted if we do one show in the future about these gender-bending environmental hormones, because I know you and I agree.
Environmental toxins?
Yes,
Yeah.
well, which are hormones, but xeno or foreign poisonous hormones, Yes.
So when it comes to inflammation and toxicity, what can our viewers be aware of related to some of the symptoms or reactions that they may be having that may be based upon inflammation and toxicity?
Rosacea is one of them,
Okay.
extreme flushing. And then, of course, just chronic generalized pain.
Yep.
That could be also thought of as fibromyalgia. That's another term of a completely other medical problem, but they both share similar symptoms. People with fibromyalgia have a lot of inflammation, and therefore people with inflammation might not be told that they have fibromyalgia, but their whole body hurts, their joints hurt. And then you were also mentioning the brain fog.
Yeah, brain fog, fatigue. One thing that we use the word toxins, and what I specifically mean are things like pesticides on our food, and those can have the endocrine disruptor.
Any particular types of pesticides?
Well, there are several different types of pesticides, and most of them fit into the category of fat-soluble toxin that's going to disrupt your system. And these toxins can get inside the cell and affect one of the energy generators of the cell, called a mitochondria. And that can affect someone's metabolism long-term, as well as the way that it affects their hormone system. And so these things in the environment, such as plastics, pesticides, things that we're exposed to, even that new car smell, those are certain toxins that we're exposed to. A lot of them get stored in our fat tissue, and they can disrupt your hormone balance and the way that your body utilizes energy, and they can contribute to obesity for that reason.
Isn't that interesting? And your thoughts related to that?
Back to inflammation, one of the major complaints I see in my office is hair loss. So somewhat painful scalps, and for us women, hair loss is such a situation which we don't like at all.
Men don't like it either, though.
Men, yes, that's right, that's right.
It's very true. They don't like it.
And so hair loss could be a generalized form of inflammation where you have too much toxins, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
So just generalized pain, and then that unusual weight gain that you are really frustrated with because you are doing you think you're doing your job in the sense of you're eating well, you're trying to work out the best you can. And so we're all struggling in this concept of appearance, and then how media glamorizes, that size 0, which I also find very unhealthy.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting because the body image is so important, yet people, if you're too big or too large or overweight, or if somebody refers to you obese, a lot of people don't understand that there may be some medical issues
Right.
going on that may be the cause of that. It is not just because
It's
of overeating.
not just because of overeating.
So I think that's important to raise people's awareness about that, so that they're not limited in their views, and that they also, related to how they relate to somebody who may be overweight or having difficulty with weight issues.
I have great sensitivity to that. I even wrote a recent article in our community about the stigma of obesity, and we are seeing quite a bit of stigma, and it even starts at the healthcare field.
It does.
Some doctors are very inappropriate in how they address overweight situations. Either they don't address it at all, or they don't have time to look at these root causes, and they might not have the rapport to really address maybe food addiction or that imbalanced relationship. But lastly, even our teachers or peers and bullying, which can be a pretty bad situation.
Well, from a cultural point of view, I think it's important we realize that we have a lot of overweight people, many
Right.
overweight people. It's because of our choices that we make and perhaps less activity. But there also may be other issues going on within our bodies, and a show like this provides people with that information so that they can get more information and take a look at it. It's really important that we address this, because how we react to one another, or calmly respond, as I always say, and be supportive and understanding and helpful in helping people to become healthy and well and live the best lives that they can. You've been listening to The Health View, and we're so delighted that you've been participating with us, and we look forward to your questions and suggestions for future topics. We want you to take good care of yourselves, take one day at a time, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great day.